So today's topic is the abstract expressionist movement. And it was a movement that itself lasted from about 1941, the early years of it, until 1956. It was divided into two groups, kind of popularly known as action painters, and that would include people like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Franz Klein. And then there was also another sort of subset of painters associated with abstract expressionism that were known as color field painters, and that would include the two most famous, Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman. But there were lots of other artists associated with abstract expressionists who kind of worked somewhere in between action painting and color field painting, and we'll take a look at them all. Probably the most famous one right away will be Adolf Gottlieb, who was right there at the beginnings of the movement and whose work doesn't really fit into either of those particular categories. So just remember that it's not just action painters or colored field painters, but those are the most famous subsets of the movement. So the thing to know about abstract expressionism, in addition to the artists associated with it and the ideas about it, is that it had a very, very long legacy. Really, the rest of the 20th century was about dealing with the legacy of abstract expressionism. It really took a hold institutionally in the American art scene, and it was very hard to shake loose. And basically, the thing that took hold is this idea of kind of single, solitary, white, male, heterosexual genius who was making these art about the freedom of the American people. And that really spoke to many, many folks. It was known as formalist abstraction, the type of works that they did, and that became the dominant critical aesthetic in America. That's what critics championed, and more importantly, that's what university art programs became associated with, and also as abstract expressionism grew, the 1950s was also this great era in American economics and in all kinds of realms for America when the economy was doing great and galleries exploded. There were just hundreds and hundreds of new art galleries. There were new museums that were being built that were often a product of wealth that had been accumulated in America. And what they all wanted to collect and what the galleries wanted to sell was abstract expressionist type art. So it really took a hold and was the game in town for literally the rest of the 20th century. One of the ideas that was really important to the enthusiasm associated with abstract expressionism, at least in the United States, is this idea that abstract expressionism marked the moment when the art world shifted from Europe to America. That is the center of the art world. It was after abstract expressionism's success that you started to see people no longer talk about Paris, about going to Paris to train to be an artist, but instead talk about New York City. And it was the first time really that an American art movement had led the way, had been in the front of a huge shift in taste and in artistic production. So it was really seen as a cultural shift, as well as this kind of there was a sense of pride in America, America first, all that kind of stuff. Even the early textbooks, this is a textbook that's actually still in print if you want to know a lot about abstract expressionism, and it's still called The Triumph of American Painting, and it really kind of waves the flag in the sense that this is such an important American moment and American movement. Like I said, galleries and museums were complicit in this idea of celebrating this uniquely American art form. And by the 50s, it was really a very lucrative process to sell art in galleries and particularly to sell this abstract art, this new art. Now, the early years, the 1940s, were not years of success for these artists, so you have to keep that in mind that they weren't really raking in a lot of cash. And even in the 1950s, as the economy of the United States was so robust, these artists weren't really seeing a lot of cash themselves. Today, you see crazy prices. You know, you see Jackson Pollock's being sold for $50 million at auction houses, but the artists themselves, you know, they were able to make a living, but they were not living in, you know, palatial estates or anything like that. They did become, those who survived did become somewhat wealthy by their old age, but at this time they weren't rolling in the dough by any shot. As I mentioned, university art programs were part of the institutional success, and maybe the most important reason why it hung on for so long is that so many people who were trained in the 1960s then get tenure track jobs and they become old professors, and they cling to this idea of the most important art being this totally abstract art that expresses your inner emotions and expresses your struggle with the world and the cosmos, which is some of the ideas associated with abstract expressionism. Now, you don't know me, but I'm 53 and I was in college in the 1980s, and there were still professors around who still thought abstract expressionism was the thing and that any other type of art was just basically bad. So I can attest personally to just the longevity of these ideas that last within a university system. And, you know, to be successful in a university system, to pass, to become a graduate, you kind of have to toe the line of what the professors want to a certain degree. In 1949, Life magazine published a kind of skeptical two-page spread in the magazine about Jackson Pollock, asking, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" And then they go on to say that some critics says he is, and others that he's degenerate, and they talk about his sales. And it's interesting. In Canvas, there's a text that you can read. It's only one page about what Life magazine said in 1949, but it's somewhat interesting. And uh, make sure you check that out. But over time, this skepticism would be kind of put to rest, and more people would come to accept that Jackson Pollock, and indeed abstract expressionism as a whole, was a really valid and important and crucial art movement for this country. One of the ways that people came around to understanding the importance of these artists really has to do with the language, the gendered language that was used by critics to describe them, almost as heroes in the American mold. So there was a mythology really that was created around them. And you know, you can look at criticism from the time period at people writing about them, and this is kind of typical. This quote that I've pulled out: "They will be remembered as a remarkably rugged lot, with minds as muscled as their bodies. They are built like athletes, and some of them paint like athletes. If paintings could explode, theirs would." I mean, it's really this overly macho kind of active type of language that shaped them into this kind of quintessential American mode of a hero. And in the 1940s and 1950s, that really had a particular appeal to a lot of people in the United States, especially after World War II. You had the popularity of war films, of westerns. The cowboy became a huge national hero in the 1950s. John Wayne, who's depicted on the left in a war film, also was often depicted as the cowboy. And it was this type of model of the macho American action hero that really was marketed in the 1940s and 50s, and these painters kind of fell into that mold, even though they themselves were not this stereotype of American maleness necessarily. Jackson Pollock kind of he played that role in public, but he was sort of a troubled person in private. There were two primary critics of abstract expressionism who were their champions, who wrote about them glowingly and tried to really construct arguments about the greatness of abstract expressionism. And one of them, whose writing relates to this idea of them as heroes is Harold Rosenberg. Harold Rosenberg wrote about the idea that when these artists were painting, they were engaged in these struggles, that they were like boxers in the ring or gladiators in the Colosseum, and that as they create things, they're also kind of creating their own identity. That art creation is as much about creating something that exists outside of yourself as it is about shaping who you are inside of yourself. It's all very kind of steeped in psychology and kind of popular ideas about the self during the 1940s and the 1950s. But I've stuck two quotes from him over there on the left-hand side. Painting is an act that is inseparable from the biography of the artist, that you just can't escape that part of painting. It's an extension of yourself. And whoever undertakes to create soon finds himself engaged in creating himself. Self-transformation and the transformation of others have constituted the radical interest of our century, whether in painting, psychiatry, or politics. And it's kind of telling, for one thing, how he uses male pronouns all the time, because that was the standard language in a patriarchy. And so you kind of just have to roll your eyes and grit your teeth at that. But also the conjoining of painting, psychiatry, and politics is also important, because he believed that this was a political act. He talked about the idea of the freedom of the artists and the freedom of the United States and the ideas of democracy and things like that. The other major critic, and he is probably more famous and more, his ideas are attach themselves to abstract expressionism more thoroughly than Harold Rosenberg, is Clement Greenberg. And Clement Greenberg's the person who wrote about formalist modernism, and he basically continued the argument that painting was art for art's sake. He didn't coin that phrase, it had been around since the 19th century, but it's this idea that painting operates in a rarefied realm. Usually when I'm in the classroom, I draw a little cloud on the whiteboard and I write art in it. And then I do some squiggles down below it, and I talk about art is not related to the world. Art is not related to the troubles of the world. Art is not related to the troubles of the artist. Art is pure. Art is just form. Art is just about this kind of transcending of the kind of dirtiness of everyday life. So it's a rejection of the world, and it's kind of spiritually pure. And for Clement Greenberg, he believed that painting in particular had been on this quest for purity, that painting was trying to engage in figuring out what was only intrinsic to painting and get rid of everything else. So painting could not be representational, because to be representational, artists have had to worry about three-dimensionality and try to make something look three-dimensional, whether it's through the use of linear perspective or it's through the use of shading and light and shadow. And so because three-dimensionality is the subject of sculpture, then painting shouldn't worry about it. And so painting should really emphasize its flatness and its color. And that's what's pure about painting. So he championed those artists who painted flatly and colorfully. And they became the kind of exhibit A for his ideas about art and what painting had been up to. Now, what that does is allows the viewer to approach a painting and not try to figure out what is this about, because he says there is no content. It's just about the color and it's just about the flatness, and that's what you should be paying attention to. But ultimately that's kind of empty, and so it hung on for a really long time. Like I said, this idea of formalist modernism lasted until the 80s, but ultimately it's been rejected in favor of content that is more personal and that has greater meaning to people. So to understand the influences that shaped the way these artists approach their work, you kind of have to understand a little bit about their personal history, their backgrounds, and what the country had been through. So the first, and you have to realize that the country had been through a lot during their lifetime. So as we now are in a pandemic, they also went through a pandemic, many of them, the 1918 flu, and then when they were children mostly, and then in the end of the 1920s, then into the 1930s, when they were young adults, they experienced the Great Depression, and they had to uh, face the uncertainty that went along with this kind of economic catastrophe. The artists that would become known as the abstract expressionists were generally about the same age. They were all born in the first decade of the 20th century, pretty much 1905, 1904, around that period. So, like I said, they experienced the flu epidemic when they were children, teenagers, and then they experienced the depression when they were young adults, so in their 20s and their 30s, and most of them were not wealthy. They were, for the most part, children of immigrants during this time, and so they were particularly hard hit by the Depression. One thing that the government did is they created the Works Project Progress Administration, and that had a federal art project associated with it. And so these artists were put to work, and one of the things that they did was they created murals. And this mural program was kind of a lifeline for artists. It employed multiple artists at a time working on a project. It employed them to go into these communities, talk to the communities, and come up with murals that would make everybody feel good about their heritage and about working hard and about progress. So these artists learned the social function of painting, and they learned to paint on a large scale in order to impact people, understanding that these large murals that they did in like courthouses and federal buildings and in post offices would impact the lives of community members. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as they become artists later in the 40s and 50s. They're thinking about scale. And one of the things that is the most impressive feature of abstract expressionist paintings is they are quite large and you can lose yourself in them. And this is generally the first experience any of them had with working large scale is working for the mural program. The next thing these artists experienced was the outbreak of World War II and the traumas associated with that. First, they witnessed the rise of Nazi Germany in Europe, and then they witnessed the entry of the United States into the war in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. None of the artists that are associated with abstract expressionism fought in the war. They were either too old or something had happened to them. And so they kind of watched from the sidelines. One of the results of the war in Europe is that the Surrealist artists, who at the time in the 30s and 40s were the most famous artists in the world, known for their, bizarre interest in psychosexual ideas of Sigmund Freud and for trying to explore the unconscious mind. Many of them left and fled Europe, fled the Nazis, and came to the United States, where they would be safe during the conflict in Europe. So many of them came to New York and New York City because it was a big city and it was kind of the place you went. And so they had an impact on the artists that lived in New York full time on these guys who became the abstract expressionists. Many of the surrealists, though, stuck to themselves. They didn't all speak English and they didn't want to get involved in the New York scene. Some of them went to like wealthy estates outside of the city and spent their time. But there were two in particular, Roberto Matta, who was Chilean by birth, from the country of Chile, but who spent lots of time in France. He came, and so did Max Ernst, who was a German artist, but who would marry Peggy Guggenheim, who was a wealthy socialite who was very interested in art and would open a very influential art gallery. And both of those guys were interested and became friends with artists of the younger generation. And both of them spoke about ideas about Sigmund Freud and about exploring the mind and the unconscious. And so these two in particular were important influences for some of the later abstract expressionists. One of the ideas that both Roberto Matta and Max Ernst uh, uh, spoke of and were part of their art was this idea of automatism, and that's this way to unlock the unconscious mind is to doodle and to distract yourself and to just make marks and then try to see what those marks reveal about your unconscious. And so it's something that they spoke about and something that would come to impact the abstract expressionists as well. Even before the war, a very important German artist had immigrated to the United States. He came in 1932, and by 1934, he'd opened his own art school. And it was going to be an art school that was incredibly influential on the younger generation of artists. He taught until 1958, when he stopped to just paint full time. But in the 20 some years that he had the art school, he really push this idea of abstraction as being a form of communication that was really just the most viable for artists. Many of his works have a very similar quality to them. You've got these areas of geometric abstraction, then surrounded by areas of more fluid or brushy abstraction. So it kind of they kind of glow, or not glow, but they kind of move in and out. There's a push-pull kind of effect that Hans Hofmann is known for. But for him, the idea of a painting was all about the process of simplification. And he believed that you had to kind of cut out what was unnecessary in order to really communicate clearly. And that was through non-representation and through this kind of bold, colorful abstraction. Another of his quotes is just championing the idea of abstraction and this idea of pure aesthetic consideration. That idea of purity is what Clement Greenberg is talking about with formalist modernism, the idea of purifying, purifying, purifying. And then Hans Hofmann states in his last sentence here, art never can be imitation. It is always only pure, pure sensation, really. So abstraction had already existed in America since the 19 teens. I'm going to just show you two artists who were working in the 30s and the 40s in New York and were painting fully abstract images. But there was generally, until the abstract expressionists, there was generally a sense of suspicion about abstraction. It was viewed as elitist, it was viewed as too European and fussy and not American. So artists who had painted in abstract style for the first 20 or 30 years of abstraction in the US were often considered minor artists. They weren't considered to be important, and their work was misunderstood. So really, when we have the full blossoming of abstract expressionism, it's the first time that people seem to get what abstract art is about in a wider sense. Here's another abstract artist I like, George L.K. Morris, and again, considered fussy and tidy abstraction, not the manly, heroic, masculine types of abstraction that we'll see with the abstract expressionists. Of course, one of the questions is why the change in abstraction in the United States from this kind of more contained European style abstraction to something that's big and expansive. And one of the answers is World War II happened. And particularly, it was not until after the end of the war that people in the United States really learned of the horrors of the Holocaust, of the Nazi attempt to exterminate Jews, to exterminate Gypsies, to exterminate anybody with a disability, to exterminate gays and lesbians. And it was then that the true evil of humanity emerged, and you saw kind of a collective recoiling from this true evil that exists. Not only that, but aside from the Holocaust, the sheer number of people who got killed in World War II was unlike anything else in history, and the amount of destruction caused by the incessant bombing and the military confrontations all over the world really was shocking when you think of the totality of it. And the American government really made sure that the citizens of the United States understood the cost of this war. They put together newsreels and other types of footage that documented the horrors of the Holocaust and of the Nazi evil. They recorded mass graves. They filmed the liberation of the camps. There was coverage in all the major newspapers of things like children's camps, where particular children were sent to special camps. And it was just this kind of almost constant unfolding of horror after horror after horror that people couldn't have imagined before the war. Another aspect of this in the United States was the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And in this instance, there was this widespread sense that kind of the evil had come home, that look what the US had done. We had destroyed thousands and thousands of innocent lives in an effort to end the war. And although, the country was kind of torn about this legacy, it was something that the artists in New York had to deal with and had to integrate into their worldview. And the New York Times, where these artists were living, covered the fallout of these explosions extensively in the newspaper. The literal nuclear fallout, the illness, the sickness afterwards, as well as the major destruction of ancient temples and other sites that were associated with these cities in Japan. So after the war, then came this period of kind of reconciling what had just happened in this world and trying to come to terms with just the horrors of it, the guilt of it, the responsibility of it, trying to understand the bigger messages. Just the sheer number of casualties in World War II dwarfed that of World War I, and was almost too large to even fathom. 50 to 80 million dead overall. That's a large spread. People are still not in agreement. Scholars are not in agreement over how many were actually killed in the war. Just the way it is. But one of the shocking things about the war was just how many more civilians died than people in the military itself, which was just a new way to wage a war, is killing all these innocent victims. 38 to 55 million civilians died during this, and as part of that number, 11 to 17 million victims of genocide by the Nazis. So again, those are Jews, ethnic Poles and Slavs, homosexuals, the Gypsies, and physically and mentally handicapped people were rounded up by the Nazis and executed, or experimented upon and then executed. And it was just a devastating figure and statistic to realize how cruel humans could treat each other. Artistically, there was an interesting correlation with representation and abstraction that related to the totalitarian regimes of the world, where realism became the method by which they communicated to the people through propaganda. And it began in 1933 with the Nazis coming to power. And when they did, Adolf Hitler insisted on cleansing the society not only of undesirable people, but of what he thought of as undesirable art. And so he began a campaign to get rid of modern art in Germany and to return art to its pre-modern days, where it was all about representation, and it created, or it depicted wholesome images of farmers, of workers, of him as a shining knight, as you can see on the left. And it became something that would last throughout the 20th century as representation and realism became associated with just the kind of backlash against modern art in the 20th century. This reached its extreme point in 1937 when the art that had been rounded up from private collections and from public museums and galleries was exhibited in a show that was labeled the Degenerate Art Show. And over 2 million Germans saw this show when it was exhibited in Berlin and Munich. It made fun of the art. It talked about the art as a product of perverted minds and immoral people, of insane people. And it was a way to discredit any type of modern art that Hitler disagreed with, abstraction, any kind of German expressionism. All the major artists of the early 20th century had their work rounded up and displayed in the Degenerate Art Show for people to mock and for people to make fun of. And people did. At the same time as the Degenerate Art Show was going on, there was also a great German art exhibition that showed what good art was supposed to be. And these were all the artists that Hitler favored, artists that were very traditional, that were academic in style, and that did not push the boundaries of what art should be, as you can see in the work on the left. And on the right, you see Hitler touring the great German art exhibition that he touted. This is also a game plan that was followed in the Soviet Union when first Lenin and then Joseph Stalin also outlawed modern and contemporary art. Artists lost their positions in universities. They were forbidden from exhibiting their work in public, which is also what happened in Germany. And the type of art that was favored by the state is art that flattered the leader, just as you see on the left, all these kids, gathered around this kind Joseph Stalin, and also work or paintings that exalted work, the labor of the common people, these women kind of rolling up their sleeves and filling up these sacks of wheat or grain or whatever that is. So it was all about the worker, and it was thought that this is what people wanted and that this is what people appreciated as good, fine art, and that nothing should make them think too much, that nothing should be challenging to them, that they should just be reflections of some idealized kind of life. Later on, when Mao Zedong came to power in China and turned that nation into a communist country, the same game plan was followed again, where art was used to placate the people, to proclaim the greatness of Mao and of these different communist ideals. And of course, all of these images hid from the world that terrible things were happening, that citizens were being killed, citizens were being thrown into labor camps, citizens were starving to death, both in the Soviet Union and in China, and that it was this was all kind of a massive cover-up in the name of totalitarian fascist authority. And while the Nazis fell in 1944, the Soviet Union lasted until the 1980s, and China is still a communist state. And so the entire 20th century was really kind of poised on this idea of this Cold War of American freedoms and the freedoms of the West, democracy versus fascism and totalitarianism and versus state control. And art became a tool to express this challenge of the century, fascism versus freedom. Abstract Expressionism came to represent the American idea of expressing one's individual self rather than conforming to a state-controlled type of art. And this kind of underlied the whole suspicion of realistic painting, of representational painting in the United States particularly. There was a sense that it was fascist, that it was retrograde, that it was some kind of propaganda in many ways. And so throughout the rest of this semester, you kind of need to think about that as the background noise for art movements that are going to come and go. There's always this tension between abstraction and realism, between freedom and fascism throughout the world. Another of the big ideas that was important to understanding abstract expressionism is that some of them were really very intrigued by and connected with ideas of psychology and of psychoanalysis. They had been introduced to the ideas of Sigmund Freud by the Surrealists, or some of them were aware of them even earlier than the Surrealists, but the Surrealists made art connections with these ideas. But a thinker that was actually a student of Sigmund Freud was Carl Jung. And after the war, there was a real enthusiasm for these ideas of Jung's, particularly in the United States. And Carl Jung was more of a spiritualist than Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is very kind of nuts and bolts in his understanding of the world and his understanding of the human mind. And Carl Jung left room for spirituality in his understanding of the cosmos and our place in it. And one of the most important ideas for Jung was this idea of the collective unconscious, this idea that no matter what separates us, whether we're from Timbuktu or Sheboygan, Wisconsin, that at this root level we share a common humanity. And deep rooted underneath our subconscious mind and the unconscious mind is this idea of the collective unconscious. Like in our reptilian brain, we are all still human. And we have these set of symbols and this set of stories within us. And although there are variations throughout the world, at the core, they are the same, and we are the same. And after a war that just showed everybody how divisive and horrible and evil humanity could be, it was this idea of reaching out and of connecting, and this idea that we weren't all different, but there was something that we could cling to in terms of our common humanity. And so there were quite a number of people who were attracted to Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, and some of those were abstract expressionists. Not all of them, but some of them felt like his ideas were definitely very valid and worth exploring. It was the ideas of symbols and archetypes that the abstract expressionist painters responded to most intently, or what Carl Jung described as primordial images or archaic remnants. So Jung believed that there was this tendency in humanity towards representing these types of things, but he didn't believe there was necessarily a specific list of, this is a certain primordial image, this is a certain primordial image. But for him, the archetype was just the psychological impulse to repeat symbols and to repeat ideas and concepts and stories without trying to be completely specific about it. So, it leaves it open to a wide variety of interpretations. And that's what you found among the different abstract expressionists. One of the great writers and thinkers of the 20th century was a man by the name of Joseph Campbell, and he studied as a comparative mythologist, and he helped to popularize the ideas of Carl Jung. He wrote a book that was published in 1949, and it was extremely popular. It remains in print today. There's a PDF of it on our Canvas site, and I would really like for you to read the preface, which is only 2 pages, pages 25 and 26, but it really encapsulates why he wrote this at this particular moment in time. And he's talking about the world that has been torn apart. And his premise for the book is he looks at the religions and myths of the world and he connects them. And it's this idea of one hero with 1,000 faces. So of the archetype of the hero, and in particular, the hero's journey. This book has been enormously influential, and it was influential to some of the abstract expressionists. And he charts this journey of the hero in all of these different texts. Excuse me, whether it's Christian or Hindu or Buddhism or the Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Star Wars, all of our great stories that exist in the world follow this typical path. In the diagram on the right, you can see it, this call to adventure, and initially the hero refuses the call, and then there's a mentor that gets involved, and various things lead to an ordeal, and then the road back, and the important return home for the hero. And he talks about how prevalent it is in all kinds of different situations, and it's something that inspired not only abstract expressionists but writers, directors throughout the 20th century, filmmakers. The whole Star Wars, the 9 parts of Star Wars follow the hero's journey, some of them individually, and then as a whole kind of cinematic history of all of them together. They follow the hero's journey as well. And that's very intentional. It's not just a coincidence that George Lucas crafted these films in this way. And when you think about these artists, particularly Jackson Pollock, who was the most famous of the abstract expressionists, here are several very famous photographs taken of him by a photographer known as Hans Nemeth. And Jackson Pollock really was the quintessential hero embarking on a journey, but it's not a journey full of external enemies, but internal ones. He's fighting his demons. He's trying to make sense of this world, trying to draw us in and create balance and peace. We'll talk a little more about this coming up and as we talk about Jackson Pollock's journey. But it was Joseph Campbell who was able to articulate this, and these artists had a sense of it. When Jackson Pollock died, he had a hero with 1,000 faces in his library, so we know that he was familiar with the concepts in the book. In 1943, 3 artists associated with abstract expressionism wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times. Only Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko signed it, but it's known that a third painter, Barnett Newman, also was helped craft this letter. And it was in response to a review of their artwork that had appeared in the New York Times a couple days before. And this is part of what it says. You can read the whole letter again in Canvas. If our works recall the known myths of antiquity, it is because they are the eternal symbols upon which we must fall back to express basic psychological truths. They are symbols of man's primitive fears and motivations, and modern psychology finds them persisting in our dreams and our art for all the changes in the outward conditions of life. So that is pure Carl Jung right there. It's what Joseph Campbell would write about, and it was a central core of what they were making art about. They're talking about this, they're relating it to their specific paintings. So keep in mind, they're writing this in the middle of World War II, and they say the feelings of primitive man have a particular persistence today in this time of violence. All primitive expression reveals the constant awareness of powerful forces, the immediate presence of terror and fear, a recognition of the brutality of the natural world, as well as the eternal insecurity of life. And art that glosses over or evades these feelings is superficial or meaningless. So, really important connection between their art and what they feel is primitive expression. They're trying to get back to the sort of terrors that exist in all human minds, whether it's so-called civilized man in the 1940s or primitive man way back at the dawn of time. One of the lines from that letter expresses this idea that primitive expression reveals the presence of powerful forces that I just read. And this is the type of thing that these artists would have been familiar with, things like African masks or pictographs or petroglyphs by native peoples in the US, or peoples actually all over the world made pictographs and petroglyphs. And so they would have had this knowledge base of so-called primitive art forms, what they called it back then. We don't call it that now, but these would have inspired these artists to kind of search for this same type of expression in order to connect with the powerful forces that were at work in the world of violence that they lived in at that time. In 1940, Adolf Gottlieb, one of the authors of the letter, had begun a series that he called the Pictograph series, in fact. And here's two examples from it, one titled Pictograph, 1941, and the other Eyes of Odysseus, also from that year. And you can see that there are these references to sort of non-Western art forms, mask-like faces that appear out of the darkness, or meandering lines, or things that could be taken from textiles, perhaps on the left. And then Odysseus, one of these great Greek mythological figures, and it's referencing kind of just these blank eyes of Odysseus and other figures within that mythological cycle. Again, a great hero's journey associated with Odysseus and the travels of Odysseus. I've got a number of these from the series here, just so you can look at them. I won't comment on every single slide coming up in the next couple images from Gottlieb, but just look at them and look at this idea of trying to convey this sense of primal fear and this sort of lurking symbols within our collective unconscious. He continued this series for about 8 or 9 years, always finding different combinations of images and ways that he was engaged with this theme. Mark Rothko, the other letter writer, was doing similar things, looking back to Greek mythology, to the early beginnings of things. The sacrifice of Iphigenia is a story that's told from the Iliad, and then this untitled figure where you've got this it's almost surrealist. This distorted woman, and you can see her bones and her guts, and then there's some classical architectural detail behind her. And his search for primordial images just, continues also during the same period of time, the early 40s. Mark Rothko is dealing with the same things that Adolf Gottlieb is, that Barnett Newman is, this omen of the eagle and hierarchical birds, these kind of symbols that are so often used in non-European art forms. Syrian Bull from 1942 is, referencing motifs from Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. And then he stated about this work, it's easy to explain the Syrian bull as a new interpretation of an archaic image involving unprecedented distortions. Since art is timeless, the significant rendition of a symbol, no matter how archaic, has a full validity today as the archaic symbol had then. But then he questions that seemingly concrete statement by asking, or is the one 3,000 years old truer? So you can see clearly, like looking back to the past and thinking about archetypes and what symbols mean and how they continue to hold on to their narrative power through time, or maybe they don't. Some of my favorite early Mark Rothkos are ones like this, Primeval Landscape or Slow Swirl at the Edge of the Sea, where it's almost like you're imagining the dawn of time, like, these amoebas at the edge of the sea that are sort of leaving the ocean and starting to come to land. And it's this transitional period of plant growth and evolutionary kind of leaps and bounds that are happening on almost the microscopic level, because these things really don't look like any animals or plant forms that we know of, but they have this kind of sense of protoplasm and stuff like that. Or two more that are, again, non-referential, but at least the title of the work on the left, Gethsemane, references the garden where Christ spent his last night before being arrested by the Romans. And so it's got this evocative title that takes you back again to this time of transition and this time of big change, but also to a time of fear and fright as the narrative of Christ's journey has him reaching the end of his mortal lifetime, and he's full of fear and doubts at the same time. So you've got all that psychological thing that is referenced by that title. Here on the left, Rothko is referencing again classical mythology, Tiresias, who was a prophet of Apollo, he sort of could see the future, or Rites of Lilith references this woman who was Adam's first wife before Eve, and who wouldn't obey, and she's part of Jewish mythology. And finally, two more, Untitled from 44 and Tentacles of Memory from 1943. By the end of 1944 into 1945, Mark Rothko sort of leaves this stage behind, and he goes towards another art form that we'll look at in a little bit. For his part, Barnett Newman, the third person who wrote the letter, but the one who didn't sign it, is also exploring similar themes: Genesis, the beginnings of things in both the Torah and in the Bible of the Christians. The Break, 1946, again, kind of this idea of the beginning of the earth, breaking free of nothingness. Or The Pagan Void, that also kind of references the same thing, but this time from a non Abrahamic religious tradition. He too explored squiggles and kind of this almost microscopic world of beginnings and of the first signs of life and transforming from one substance into the next. Two more in the similar vein. For his part, the work of Jackson Pollock in his early years was also kind of exploring mythology, in this case, American mythology, making paintings about going west and about settlers, as you can see in these works from the late 1930s. At this time, Jackson Pollock is living in New York, but he had been born in Cody, Wyoming, and he grew up out west, living in both Arizona and California. So he kind of had a sense of being a Westerner himself. And so part of painting like this is painting his identity of who he feels like he is, especially in New York. He kind of feels like this maverick and like this cowboy. At the time, his teacher at the New York Art Students League is a guy by the name of Thomas Hart Benton, who was very well known in the 1930s in the United States as being one of the regionalist painters who painted scenes from the South, particularly from the Ozarks and from Missouri, of ballads and old country songs and things like that. Thomas Hart Benton was somebody who insisted on representation, and he was a great big foe enemy of studying in Europe or of any kind of modern art, any kind of abstraction. He was totally against it. But he was kind of fighting against the odds at this point in America. By the 1940s, America starts to embrace abstraction, and Thomas Hart Benton's ideas are decidedly old school. But you can definitely see the influence of him in the work of Jackson Pollock, particularly the way you've got all these kind of undulating, curving lines. Everything has this kind of soft rhythm to it in the works of Thomas Hart Benton. And if you go back to the Jackson Pollock images we just saw, you can see the same type of undulating line in the clouds and in the mountains and even in the earth formations. It's all sort of gently swaying in a similar way that Thomas Hart Benton was doing. Later that same year, though, that Jackson Pollock painted Going West, he starts exploring the ideas of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, and he starts painting things that are more about kind of universal signs of humanity, of mankind, and no longer specific things, set in the Old West. So he's got Naked Man of 1938 to 1940, where you've got this figure, and then his head has been replaced by this almost bird mask, and there's this circle, and seems to be motion around the figure, and also other strange kind of talismanic-like objects. Or Woman of 1938, where you've got this woman who's this just large kind of mother figure. She seems like she's giving birth. People are surrounding her. She's the largest figure there. Again, there's a sense of the primordial and the sense of archetypal like images. Or also in that same time period, Naked Man with a Knife. So you've got this violent action of all these body parts really kind of coming together as this sort of sense of maleness in conflict. Or Head, which also is this kind of tumultuous image where you can see this figure that's almost like got bull horns, an extra eye, another ear up there in the corner. 1941 is a significant year for Jackson Pollock because you can see his work starts to change. He starts to create these more overall compositions where the increasingly it's more and more abstract. You've got these curvy lines that really go from corner to corner, and the imagery itself starts to become more and more vague, just as we saw in the last set of comparisons where you started to see more and more activity. But you could distinctly make out what was being depicted. Now you lose that sense of clarity, and it starts to become more and more broken up, and things become less and less legible in these works. But the titles also still continue to evoke this idea of mythology, of universality. The Mad Moon Woman, who is she? What does that represent? She's not depicted here any longer. But we get this sort of sense of symbols that have kind of been broken up. Or with Birth from 1941, that same year, you kind of get like maybe a leg that seems to be open, but you lose the body of the woman that was giving birth in the work from a couple years earlier, and instead you have this repetition of circles and of these curved lines. Well, one important thing that happened this year is the Museum of Modern Art put on an exhibition that had a lot of New York really excited because it was the first time that Native American art had been shown in an art museum. Usually, if you wanted to look at Native American objects, you went to an anthropology museum or a natural history museum. But the Museum of Modern Art is declaring for these works of art that they are works of art. And so Jackson Pollock, we know, went to the Museum of Modern Art and saw this show, and elements from Native American imagery start finding their way into his artwork. In that same year, you can even see works of art that appeared in the show appearing in his paintings. So this is Birth that we just looked at a minute ago, and on the right is an Inuit mask that was shown. This exact mask was shown in New York in the 1941 exhibition. And you can see that this face with a big crooked smile and an eye, a single eye that has been enhanced through paint, appears sort of a third of the way down of the composition. I've isolated it in the middle and rotated it so you can see sort of an upright version of it as this mask that is this element that appears now as a symbol in this universal concept of birth in Jackson Pollock's work. And it's kind of appropriate. This is the birth of this whole new way of experimenting and this way of thinking for Pollock himself. It's like he's being reborn. In 1943, Jackson Pollock painted the work on the left titled Circle, and it's a circular canvas on which he has painted this bird-like image and then kind of broken it down into different abstract elements. And he seems to have been thinking about shields that were used as protective devices on the plains where Native peoples, Native warriors in particular, would wear them into battle, and they were considered spiritual protection. And important animals that were linked to that individual warrior would be painted on it as a symbol of protection. And so you've got this similar idea perhaps being explored by Jackson Pollock. From that same year, Moon Woman cuts the circle. Again, this kind of mythological sense, but it doesn't fit into any known mythology or story of Native peoples or anybody really for that matter. And but you can still see this outline in the upper right corner of a Native American male with a headdress on and what appears to be war paint on his face, and he's kind of melting. And it's also melting in a way that references Salvador Dali and Salvador Dali's psychology. And if you think about some of Salvador Dali's works with the melting faces that you can see inset into the left, you get a sense of how a lot of different influences go into forming a visual vocabulary. Moon Woman shows up again in the work on the left. This seems to be some kind of symbol that he's particularly drawn to, this archetype, this idea of the moon, of night, of femininity and masculinity. He starts to experiment with over in the work on the right, male and female. You can see that there's roughly two kind of vertical vertical slabs that have writing on one on the right, and it's not quite clear what they are, but he's identified them for us as male and female. So we know he's sort of dealing with these two life principles in the world, right? Male, female, yin, yang, things like that. And so he's sort of developing this vocabulary that's kind of surrealist on the one hand, but is also reflecting his understanding of these Jungian and Joseph Campbell ideas. In 1943, Jackson Pollock painted three large horizontal paintings that indicate he's still thinking about archetypes, still thinking about primordial images and things like this. And the first one is titled She-Wolf from 1943, like I just said. And again, it's kind of representational, but also kind of abstract. You can recognize that there is a very large female wolf in the center of this composition. And then it kind of breaks down into a lot of lines and meanders and different colors. In the painting, it's most likely that he's referencing the famous she-wolf from the history of Rome, where this she-wolf saved these two little infants, Remus and Romulus, from certain death. And she raised them, and they grew to boyhood, where they were adopted by a human. But thanks to her and a woodpecker, they were able to survive. And so you don't often see the woodpecker depicted, but the she-wolf is iconic and very famous. And this is an image from way back in history, from the Etruscan civilization, of a she-wolf. So he's sort of picking up on this archaic image and bringing it forward into the 20th century. The second painting from 1943 is titled Pasiphae, and Pasiphae is a mythological figure. She was a queen who was married to King Minos on the island of Crete, and unfortunately she was a victim of Poseidon's pranks. He was mad at her husband, so he made her fall madly in lust with a white bull. And so she figured out a way to have sex with the bull, and then she gave birth to the Minotaur, who was half man, half bull. So again, this is kind of like birth in a way that She-Wolf was kind of like birth. It's about a motherly figure, but also about a sexual female as well. It's about the beginnings of the Minotaur story, just like the She-Wolf is about the beginnings of the founding of Rome, ultimately. So going back to these times of birth and beginning seems to be a theme for him. You can make out some figures in Pasiphae. You can make out figures on either side, and then there seems to be some kind of tumultuous conflict in the middle. Maybe that's her and the white bull, but it is again part of this mythic journey that it seems Jackson Pollock's on. And then the last one from that year is titled Guardians of the Secret. It's not quite as tumultuous as the Pasiphae that we just looked at, but there is, again, two figures on either side, and then in the center there is a large horizontal rectangle, and underneath that is a dog or a wolf. This is an image that doesn't reference any specific myth or any specific mythological character, so it's unlike the first two that we saw, but it does seem to be, again, connected with these ideas of Native American mythology and ritual and kind of ceremony that he was also interested in. For this work, it's believed that he was looking at a Zuni or perhaps a Hopi altar. These are altars set up where prayers are offered to different types of spirits, and oftentimes they are framed by two figural representations of these types of Kachina spirits that are really kind of long and rectangular, just like the two figures are on either side here. And then also there is a back to this altar that kind of makes it look like, in some ways, a bed. I know to Western eyes, it kind of looks like a four-poster bed or something like that. But you can kind of see a similar configuration here with Jackson Pollock's work. The figures have masks on. There seems to be indications of feathers. And we know from looking at his sketchbooks at the same time that he's still drawing Native American themes. They still pop up, even though the exhibition at MoMA was in 1941. Here are a couple pages of those sketchbooks, and you can see things like Native American masks. For example, in the work on the right, you can see those twice. They seem to be Kachina spirit masks from the Southwest, or on the left, more like pictographic figures. Looks like there's a buffalo uh, dancer there, perhaps, and other sketches include things like totem poles and canoes. So it was a theme that he was still working with and still engaged with. You can tell a lot from his sketchbooks, from the sketchbooks of any artist, but one thing in particular you can also see with Pollock is he was kind of engaged in a rivalry with Pablo Picasso. At the time, Picasso would have been the most well-known artist of the 20th century. And one theme that appears throughout images of Pollock's in his sketchbooks is this horse with his mouth open. Sometimes it's screaming. It seems like you can see it in the center of this oil sketch on the left, and then a drawing from his sketchbook on the right. Down below is an actual head by Picasso of a horse screaming, and it appears frequently in the works of Picasso. And we know that Pollock really thought of himself as a rival to Picasso. He wanted to be as well known as Picasso had become, and he ultimately would be. The most important Native American artistic and ritual tradition that Jackson Pollock came into contact with again in 1941 is the Navajo practice of what's called sand painting in English. And it took him quite some time to kind of figure out what sand painting meant to him. Ultimately, though, it's one of the influences that helped him to develop his technique of dripping paint on a canvas on the floor and making the canvas into a kind of sacred space, a ritual space, a space of healing. And so to understand that, you have to understand something about Navajo sand painting. And so the first thing is that he saw a demonstration in 1941 at the Museum of Modern Art, and this is a photograph from that demonstration that occurred while the exhibition was up. But he had also seen this when he was a child in Arizona, and so there's a connection to his own personal history with this that made it even more meaningful for Jackson Pollock. So the tradition of sand painting involves a healer and then a healer's assistants. And what they do is they create out of sand and dirt and pigment and feathers and um, vegetal matter, these images. And they're images of the universe in a particular balance. Because for the Navajos, balance is everything. To walk in harmony, or the term is hozo, is to be centered and at one. And so when somebody is suffering from an illness or misfortune, one of the things that they can do is have a healer create a sand painting for them, which becomes a vortex of healing energy. And the person who is having the sand painting done will sit in the middle of the sand painting while songs are sung over the person to help that person, again, walk in harmony, walk in balance. And the designs that are created of the sand painting are all dependent upon what the particular situation is, what the time of year it is, what everything that was going into diagnosing what the problem is. That's what the healer does. And then the healer has a set of images that the healer knows, a set of songs, a set of prayers that are all unleashed in order to create a healing event. By the end, the sand painting is dispersed back to nature. So it's not something that is permanent. It's just sort of transitional, transitory, impermanent. So by the 20th century, this important ritual practice had become almost like a tourist attraction in the Southwest. It was a way for desperately poor Navajo people to make a living, to earn some money, And so what you see is it becoming somewhat divorced from its traditional ceremonial function. Now, it continued to be used for ceremony within Navajo communities, but then there was also this kind of public display where it's kind of lost its ritual value. So that's what would have happened at MoMA. It was more of a demonstration of how it's done. This is just another healer and a view of a particular sand painting that this healer is doing. But put all these things together, put these ideas together for Pollock and for this idea of healing himself. And he was an alcoholic, and he struggled with that, and he struggled with his temper, and he struggled with personality issues. And then he's also in this world that is suffering from World War II and the horrors of that. And ultimately, by 1947, things are going to click for Jackson Pollock. And this central metaphor of the art on the ground being a center for healing, a center to create balance, will become more and more important for Jackson Pollock. So by 1947, when he puts his canvas on the ground and starts dripping the paint over it, and I hope you will watch the video on canvas that I've put there that demonstrates how this was done. In this photograph by Hans Namath, again, the same photographer I showed you earlier, Pollock is dripping his paint, and that's his wife, Lee Krasner, who's also a painter, sitting on the stool behind him, kind of watching him. But he's become the healer. He's become the shaman or the traditional singer within Navajo communities. He is the one who's creating this web of balance. And he would often describe his creations of these paintings as having to strike the right balance so that it's all a harmonious whole. So that's what he's doing. He's creating this ritual stage. It's not just a painting, it's a painting where he himself can work to achieve balance. And it can be on a personal level, it can be on a global level. And in that sense, he is the hero on a journey. And the journey is to fix himself, and the journey is to fix us. And the goal is for him to confront the terrible ugliness of the world and to work it all out on this canvas, to create beauty, to create an image that charts his path so that we can find our own path. We can know his story, and then we can find our own story. It's pretty deep. So by 1949, when Life magazine covered Jackson Pollock and asked, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? It had really only been 2 years since his first all-over spatter painting had been done. And so he really became famous in a very short amount of time for this work that he was doing and for how quickly it resonated with people at the time. It was pretty remarkable. Full Fathom 5 is one of the very first paintings that Pollock did in 1947 that has this all-over drip technique. And what he does, again, as seen in the video, is he just layers paint. He uses enamel house paint, and he flicks it, and he drips it, and he drops it, and he weaves these really complex webs of layers of paint. And it's like the layers of life's experience. It's like the journey we all go on. It's like the tumultuous chaos of the universe coming together and forming this ordered place. It is kind of all of these things, and it's a great achievement. I know that people say a 5-year-old could do this, but 5-year-olds end up making very sloppy and ugly drip paintings. So do most students and art people. It takes a real talent to just really create the depth and the truly the balance that Pollock does. He's got a great eye for color. These are a lot more subtle when you see them in person. In reproductions, they tend to kind of flatten out, but you see depth. You see these like layer upon layer of things in them. So I've got a number of them here that you can just look through, different ones, different configurations. Probably the most effective are the large ones, the ones that are the size of a room that really envelop you as you stand in front of it, like the Grand Canyon or like you're in front of the cosmos itself. Those are the ones where you really lose yourself. Some are rather small and not necessarily as magnificent as the large ones, but the large ones can be wondrous and magnificent and send you on your own journey. Some of them have handprints from where Pollock left his mark on it. Some of them have bits of his cigarette he was smoking when he was painting it, so it becomes autobiographical in that sense also. So it's your journey, but it's his journey. It's both of your journeys. It's this world journey. For his part, by 1946, Mark Rothko had gotten rid of any identifiable images in his paintings and was doing these works that have these kind of pulsating, blobby kind of forms of color that kind of overlap and they kind of pulsate in a way. And he did this for a few years after his initial works that I already showed you, remember that were all kind of about mythology and things. And ultimately, these multitude of forms gave way to just fewer and fewer forms, more solid, but also ethereal at the same time. If you remember the advice of Hans Hofmann, it's simplify, 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 and Rothko really seems to be doing that. By 1949, Mark Rothko had broken through to his signature style, where it's just a few of these forms and these shapes, but their edges are often blurred, and they continue that sort of pulsating, um, ethereal quality. And what Mark Rothko was after was for, again, viewers to lose themselves in these paintings. They were large, and he wanted their emotional power to speak to viewers on an emotional level. Ultimately, he was hoping for emotional catharsis in front of his paintings and for this kind of almost a spirit conversation to happen in his works. And really, this became the work of his life to continue to create paintings like this for the next 20 years until his death in 1970. He would be engaged with looking at all these variations and permutations about color and emotion and connection in that way. And he never seemed to tire of coming up with new ways to achieve this. So again, you can flip through the next. I won't really have lots of comments, but you can just look at the variety of different images. It's the work of Rothko that's considered to be color field painting, along with Barnett Newman, who we'll look at next. So they are the color fields, and you can see how much of a different effect and a different feel these have from something like the action painting of Jackson Pollock, where he leaves it all on the canvas, and you trace his journey. Here, it's more of an inner contemplative, meditative quest. The other really well-known color field painter is Barnett Newman, as I mentioned already. And again, by about 1946, 45, he was abandoning his smaller little imagery that he had been doing and moving to larger canvases and looking at large forms and focusing on color. He was painting these canvases like the one on the left with these horizontal lines. And in 1949, he painted the work on the right. Maybe it was 48, I forget, but it's titled One Mint. And it was the vertical line that really spoke to him. It was something that he identified with as an individual, like this line in the middle of space is kind of like a solitary being in the universe. And Barnett Newman, as well as Mark Rothko, were both from the Jewish tradition, and within this religious tradition, there's not a lot of figurative imagery. Instead, you've got abstraction that is part of the interior of Jewish temples. You don't have this narrative tradition that you often find in Christian churches. And so equating abstraction with spirituality and with some kind of moral universe is kind of came as second nature to Rothko and Newman, perhaps, and certainly their development of these kind of intensely private, personal, devotional images often have this religious feel to it. Newman often referred to these vertical lines as zips. And again, that's the idea that they stand in for an individual. Not always are they alone, though. Sometimes you find them in pairs or multiples. For example, the work on the right, the immediate white zip stands out. But the more you look, the more you see that there's also some that are just slightly visible in the red. And the thing about Barnett Newman's paintings is that the background isn't all just this flat uniform color. And the surface changes, and it's a worked up surface, and so you really have to stand and appreciate the depth and the layering of the background. It's not just about the zip, it's about the whole thing. It's about the whole journey. It's, again, the individual hero on the journey. Sometimes you need helpers, and so those helpers can appear in the background as other zips. Here's two more where they move to the edge, and you can just, kind of lose yourself in these. Although the zip paintings can really be considered Barnett's breakthrough in terms of hitting this kind of iconic, recognizable style, the best works by him are these really large ones that are as large as the walls in your house and that really dwarf the viewer, and you sort of lose yourself in staring at the modulated color and paint, and you can sort of stand in the zip and focus on the zip and seeing the rest of the painting in your peripheral vision and really being swallowed up by it. Cathedra is a great example of that. It's this deep contemplative blue. It feels religious. It feels like you're having some kind of spiritual occasion. Heroic Sublime Man is another one that's just vast and quite large and mesmerizing to be in its presence and in its space. You can kind of get a sense of scale of them here, but what I wanted to show you this for is particularly the work on the right. That's Barnett Newman and Betty Parsons, who was a gallery director who showed his work and represented him. And they're demonstrating the best way to view his painting, and that is to get very close and kind of just stick your nose in it, although not literally, because if you do that in a museum, the guard will yell at you. So you don't want to do that. But he did believe that you should get up and get lost in it. And so here's this guy at the Museum of Modern Art on the left doing that. He understands what Barnett Newman wanted him to do. Again, I'll show you a few more. I won't really make any comments, but you can just, you know, zone out with them. This one kind of reminds me of Tatooine, Star Wars, Two Sons. Two more in this vein. It wasn't until 1956 that he really developed what is considered his signature style or his breakthrough, and that is these works that are titled the bursts, the burst series, where both the upper and the lower kind of have this greater intensity to them, as if they have burst. Um, and it's in a vertical format that he'd experimented with earlier in the 50s, but now began to really work solely in this format. And you can see how it's kind of a cross between action painting and color field. They're moody and evocative, but they also have the action of the burst and this sense of movement and dynamic motion to them at the same time. And then two final more. So what you see when you get to look at the work of Pollock and Gottlieb and Newman and Rothko, these sort of four original first generation abstract expressionists, is they all developed a signature style. They all had these breakthroughs where they kind of move into this large form of brilliant abstraction. And it really becomes their signature. And once you see one, you're able to recognize, all the others because they are essentially the same. And what developed in the 1950s and 1960s is a huge market that saw these objects become highly desired for the wealthy, for the newly emerging wealthy class that was taking advantage of post-war success of the United States. And these were symbols of one's cultural relevance, and they indicated that you understood the most important post-war art, and so they continued to be produced by these artists until these artists died. Pollock died first in 1956 in a car accident, but then these others continued to live. Mark Rothko died in 1970. He killed himself, but the others lasted into the 70s and the 80s, still producing works like this. And now, if you go into a museum anywhere in the world, if they've got a 20th century collection, they've got representations of abstract expressionism by these four major artists. Willem de Kooning is one of the most famous abstract expressionists, and he's associated with action painting, but he's an unusual abstract expressionist in that he never developed a signature style like the others that we've just looked at. Instead, he always experimented. He was always changing up the way he painted, what he painted. He didn't have issues about painting representational images throughout his career. And so he's very unique in that way. He is Dutch. He immigrated to this country. And these are the type of paintings he was doing in the early 1940s. Seated women that are done in this colorful, abstract way. In the mid 1940s, he kind of started to pull these bodies apart. You've got these really great kind of fleshy expanses here. They look like they were formerly these women that he was painting, although there's nothing that references the women specifically. They kind of just look like soft body parts. For a couple years, beginning in 1947, he started painting these black and white and gray paintings that aren't representational, but instead are just full all over abstractions. He gave them different titles. For example, Light in August is the title of a William Faulkner book set in the South. Part of it deals with race relations, so you wonder, is the black and white here, the struggle, is it related to that? He did put content into his work. But then the next two paintings I'll show you are paintings that don't have any reference in their titles. This is just painting of 1948. From that same year, another work untitled. But one of the great things about these black and white paintings is just how different they all are. They have a different feel, they have a different type of black and white. Some have a little bit of color, like this one in 1948. You can definitely see layers. And he wasn't a fast painter. He often took his time painting his work. He would layer it, he would scrape things off, and that's one of the descriptions of him, is just how methodical he was as a painter. Asheville from 1948 is when he was also at the same time painting these black and white paintings. So he shifts in the middle of doing series. This references time that he spent in North Carolina, and some people believe they can make out different forms within Asheville that are linked to the landscape or to some element in North Carolina. Others believe it to be a full, just abstract composition. By 1949, he had abandoned the black and white, and this is Gansevoort Street. That's all in red, but it's also got little bits of representational images in there. You can make out architectural structures, little houses. So again, going back to referential things, having content that relates to this exterior reality, not just being pure abstraction. Excavation of 1950 looks somewhat like Asheville of 1948. Also, it looks somewhat like other works that he was doing at the same time. So he's just very eclectic. He doesn't stick with one thing. At the same time, he's doing multiple works and never is in search of a style that will define him. He likes the fact that he is undefinable. The work for which he's most well known today is the series of paintings that he did of women between 1948, so the same time he was doing Asheville, and the same time he was doing some of his black and white series. He began a woman series where he would paint these large, kind of frightening, menacing, grotesque images of a woman who's been pulled apart and put back together and scraped off and put back on together. A lot of people read things into these paintings that he's got violent tendencies against women or whatever, but it's hard not to, because of some of them are just so grotesque. One of the ways that you can think about this woman series is to think about Jungian archetypes and to think about psychology and psychological types, the idea of the ever-present mother, the idea of the eternal feminine. If we think back to the Jackson Pollock painting of birth that you see here in this miniaturized version, you know that it's something that other abstract expressionists are thinking about and dealing with it, although this was about 10 years earlier than de Kooning's. Some people have made the observation that the figures of de Kooning have very large breasts, they're oftentimes overweight, or they have large bodies. Sometimes the arms are small and the feet are barely there. And that corresponds to a whole type of sculpture that was being made 40,000 years earlier by people who lived during the Paleolithic period, who were painting in caves and traveling around with herds of animals. And they made these very small rock sculptures that they carried around with them as perhaps representations of the female presence. Maybe they lived in a maternal society. Maybe this was a representation of the life-giving goddess of all things, of Mother Nature concept. But all these ideas are connected to this post-war search for meaning. there's got to be something, that there's got to be a rebirth. Perhaps that it's in the power of women to facilitate that birth. So that's a one uh, viable reading. Other people point to the fact that these women are often aggressive looking, that they're slashed, that they're torn apart, and they suggest that it's more of an anti-woman message. And there's whole arguments to go along with that idea as well. So I won't tell you which one to think or which one to accept, but just know that there's lots of varying interpretations that have to do with de Kooning's women. On the left is de Kooning's woman on a bicycle, and you can see that her mouth is repeated. Her mouth is open in this kind of grin, this perhaps devouring grin. Some people have suggested these are devouring mothers, this psychological type, the ultimate fear that your mother is going to consume you, that you came out of her body and she will take you back into it. And this interpretation, can get into the specifics of de Kooning's relationships with women, with his wife. There he is on the right with his wife Elaine de Kooning, who's also a painter whose work we'll look at. What was his relationship with his mother like? Are these expressions of his psychological issues? He did make a number of them, about 8 or so during this 5-year period. And today, they're probably the most well-known of the works by Willem de Kooning, despite the fact that he worked in so many other different styles and was mostly abstract in the work that is known today. It's these representational images that people are most fascinated by. And a final two more. Most of these women are not identified. They're not identified as specific women. They're not portraits of a particular woman. He never labels any of them mother or my wife or anything like that. Instead, they're woman one, woman two, woman three, woman on a bicycle. So very kind of neutral titles. In 1954, he did paint a painting of Marilyn, though, that he titles Marilyn, and it is this image of Marilyn Monroe, the most famous American movie star at the time. And most people associate images of celebrities with the pop art movement that will begin in 1962. And here you can see that Willem de Kooning is painting this, 8 years in advance of that, and kind of already thinking about pop culture in a certain way. And Willem de Kooning actually is going to be a very open-minded painter. As an artist, he's glad to see pop art, and he's glad to see people challenging the hegemony of abstract expressionism. And he's pretty much alone in that. Other members of the abstract expressionist community, other painters, artists, really disliked later art movements and later artists. But Willem de Kooning was always open to younger generations. So that's cool of him. More gestural abstraction, so you really can see why he's considered an action painter. Even when he's painting these images of women, you can see him slashing and marking through and kind of really engaging with the canvas in a very, very active way that suggests motion and suggests the type of action for which these painters were known. He continued to paint for 30 years after this women series, and always changed his style. This is the style he was painting in the 1980s. In the early 80s, he was still going and still producing just variations on abstraction. Well, if Willem de Kooning was always changing his styles, the next artist, his friend Franz Klein, he definitely stuck to this style once he figured it out, and he painted nothing else for about the last 14 years of his life. Perhaps he died when he was only 52 of, unfortunately, a heart condition. But beginning in 1948, he actually had been advised by his friend Willem de Kooning to use a projector because he was trying to work out a composition of a painting he was doing, and the projector would take the drawing and project it onto the wall or onto a canvas. And Franz Klein was messing around with this projector, and rather than do what he originally intended, he started blowing the image up, and so he could only see a portion of it, and it turned the image into abstract marks and abstract lines. And Franz Klein really liked the way that looked, and so he started painting these images that are just black and white images that completely are abstract. They also look like calligraphy. He had been interested in Japanese calligraphy in particular, and so he was familiar with that tradition. And so this painting develops in 1948, and he would continue to paint these black and white compositions until 1962, when he unfortunately died. So he really stuck to his aesthetic and this particular style, and he really never wavered until the very end of his life. He was starting to change things up, but then he died, like I said. It should also be noted that in 1948, de Kooning himself was experimenting with black and white paintings. We saw the work already. This is an example on the right, though, that's also from 1948 by de Kooning, and then a work by Klein on the left. And you can see how they really kind of overlap in a certain way. It's more loopy and drippy in the de Kooning at this stage, but and I'm not saying this to suggest that Franz Klein stole from de Kooning, but that ultimately he came to really embrace this black and white calligraphy style. Whereas for de Kooning, as with everything, it was just kind of a passing fancy, and he moved on to other things. But Klein really stuck to it. I'll show you a few more sets of these, just because they are all unique and they're all different. And some of them are more controlled, and some of them seem more loose and gestural. He often talked about how it was just as important for him to paint the white as it was for the black, that he didn't really view these as positive and negative spaces in a way that, it was just black marks on a white paper or a white ground. That wasn't the way he perceived it. But I'll let you just look at the next two slides after this without my commentary. In the last couple years of his life, as I mentioned before, he started to change things up. He started introducing color into the work. He never really felt satisfied with it. He had only experimented with it for about 2 years before he died in 1962. So never really got to where he wanted to with the color application. So kind of the classic, Franz Klein works are these works in black and white. I think his auction record might be like 40 million, I believe, is the highest one of those has ever sold for. So, they're in demand. Another artist who established a style and stuck with it was Clyfford Still. He was one of the earliest of these artists to switch to all over abstraction as early as 1938 to 1940s when he made that switch. And he developed this style of painting that's kind of called color field, but it's a little bit more broken up than some other color field artists that you typically think of, like Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko. There's a little bit more activity going on in a Clyfford Still, but this is kind of what you see in this image is what you get with a Clyfford Still. It almost looks like camouflage in a way. This is before camouflage was developed, but there's a certain patchiness to it. It's almost, it's really interesting. There's really nothing else like it. And once you see it, it's kind of undeniably the Clyfford Still style. Here's two more. I mean, it always kind of reminds me of puzzle pieces. You know what I mean? Like the work of Newman and Pollock, some of these can get quite large, wall size, room size even, where you really do lose yourself in these little bits of craggly color. Robert Motherwell's the last abstract expressionist we'll look at. He was the youngest, born in 1915, so he was 3 years younger than Jackson Pollock. And he was also the wealthiest. He was born into a very rich family. His father was the president of Wells Fargo Bank. And his father insisted that Motherwell not pursue painting, even though Motherwell wanted to be a painter. And his father made a deal with him that if he got a PhD in a subject so that he'd always have something to fall back on, he would pay him $50 a week for the rest of his life, which was enough at the time in the 1930s for Robert Motherwell to sort of feel like that was a good deal. So Motherwell went to Harvard, got a PhD in philosophy, but was also very interested in art history, and he then turned around and became a painter. He was the smartest of the abstract expressionists because he was very well educated. I mean, book smart. I mean, not like life smart, but so he also was able to speak with a lot of the surrealists because they spoke other languages, and he was very influenced by them, and he helped other people to get to know some of these surrealists when they came over in the 1940s. His own work is kind of an eclectic mix of things. He painted kind of according to his own style, listened to his own drum beat, I guess you could say. And he never really particularly worried about sales and about uh, creating a definable style in a sense. His early work, these are a couple of his early works, were him exploring abstraction. He was interested in automatism that he learned directly from the surrealists. And then he worked really in a range of styles, as you'll see. Some of his work is very bold graphically, wonderful use of blacks in particular that really stand out, give it really a real intensity. In 1948, he made a painting, a large painting, that he titled Elegy to the Spanish Republic. And an elegy is kind of like a mournful acknowledgement, a mournful kind of um, uh, keening for something that has passed. And it's in response to the Spanish Civil War and the end of the Spanish Republic. And it's something that Motherwell would return to until his death in 1991. He didn't just paint this series, but he painted this off and on until he died. And it really meant a lot to him, this kind of idea of a utopian dream that's died, and the assumption of a totalitarian government, which is what happened in Spain. And the Elegy to the Spanish Republic series, what it features is these ovoid shapes and then these bar shapes, this repeated motif that will pop up again and again in paintings for the next almost 50 years. And he does over 100 of them, all different aspects, and he never repeats the exact same one, but it's just this theme that he returns to over and over again, kind of the struggle of the 20th century between freedom and totalitarianism. In the meantime, he makes plenty of other paintings as well, so a whole range of abstraction, smaller types of abstract canvases like these, or massive wall-size paintings like this one. Or this one, another quite large work by Motherwell. So one thing to keep in mind about all of these abstract expressionists is that they um, really considered themselves a group. Some of them were friendly, others of them were rivals, but they would often all meet at the Cedar Tavern after being in their studio painting all day. And they would meet there and they would drink, and some of them would get drunk, and some of them would argue, but they were all arguing about art and about the purpose of it and the meaning of it. They formed an art club which met on a regular basis, and they sponsored speakers to talk about art and to talk about the important things related to art in the world at the time. So it was a group of people who were really committed to these art ideas, committed to there being a center of art in New York, and it was a close-knit group. In 1950, a group of them were called the Irascibles, which is kind of like troublemakers, in an article in Life magazine because they had basically um, publicly challenged the Metropolitan Museum for having really not very good modern art collections, not showcasing the best in contemporary art, really being European focused and not focusing on new trends in American art, especially. And so this is the famous photograph of them that became famous later of the Irascibles. And in this image, you have people like Jackson Pollock, and you've got Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman, and other people that we'll see in a second, Theodore Stamos, Bradley Walker Tomlin, and a group of people that really acted as a group of people and were not yet seen as a movement in 1950, but would become the movement of abstract expressionism. Important to note before we move on from abstract expressionism that a great deal of their success was due to two very important women. The first was Peggy Guggenheim, who came from a wealthy family, who opened the Art of the Century Gallery from 1942 to 1947. And she was married to Max Ernst for a short time when he first uh, left Europe and came to the United States. In fact, he came to the United States because Peggy Guggenheim basically saved him. But it was this gallery that she opened in 1942 that showed the Surrealists when they came over, introduced the Surrealists to the young members of the Abstract Expressionists. She championed some members of the Abstract Expressionist group, like especially Jackson Pollock, who she had a real soft spot for. She gave the first show to Clifford Still, and she really provided an important gathering place for these young artists. And then she gave the showcase to many of them as well. So she was very crucial. After 1947, she shut her gallery and she moved back to Europe. She went to Italy, where she opened a museum. Here's Jackson Pollock in front of a really important mural that he did for Peggy Guggenheim. It's known today as the Guggenheim mural. Another very important woman was Betty Parsons. She had trained herself as an artist, and that's one of her paintings on the left, excuse me, on the right. But ultimately, she is most known for being a gallery owner. She opened her gallery while Guggenheim's gallery was still in New York in 1946. But the following year, after Guggenheim's gallery closed, a lot of the artists that were associated with her came over to Betty Parsons. And Betty Parsons spent years building up their reputations, making sure that their work got into museum collections, got into the best hands, and really building up their success. She's in large part responsible for the financial success that a lot of them were able to enjoy later in life because of things that she did for them at the beginnings of their careers. So Betty Parsons really important for that. But I want to just show you some of the work that she also did on her own. She always painted, but she often didn't have time to devote to painting large canvases because she was so busy with her gallery. So what she started to do was collect pieces of driftwood uh, from her commute to the gallery, she would find old abandoned pieces of wood. Some of it was driftwood, some of it was just construction wood, I guess. And she would collect them, and then she would paint them, and she would make these funky sculptures. And I don't think enough people really ever get to see them, so I'm going to show you a bunch of her sculptures just because I think they're really great. She would paint these blocks individually, and then she would create compositions with them that became sculptural, and they were like reliefs, and she would hang them on the walls. And although they're not abstract expressionist works, they are just interesting works. She didn't ever really consider them important or high art or anything. Like I said, she continued to paint on canvas when she had the time, but this really became an outlet for her creative expression. Some of these are just very simple and uncomplicated, while others of them become more and more complex. She found inspiration in a range of things from African to Native American art objects to folk art to children's toys. And these all kind of have this light, almost whimsical sense of toys to them. One final pairing. Look, you can see on the right, it's an old oar, like a paddle that broke off, and she found it, and so she incorporated it into her art. We should all make art like this. Unfortunately, there are some abstract expressionists who were there that were part of the Cedar Tavern and went to the art club and were photographed with the Erasmus, but just never got the fame that these others did. They're often referred to as secondary abstract expressionists, or even sometimes people have referred to them as the lesser abstract expressionists, and you feel really bad for them because they are, involved in the same discussions. They're working in creating unique works of art that have never been done before, and yet they just don't have the name recognition, they don't have the financial success, they don't get the gallery representation, and their works aren't purchased for museums until much later. And so I just wanted to show a few of those works, not really talk about them too much, but just give you a sense of some of these works and the great work that it actually is, but sadly, the fame didn't come. This is a work on the left by by Bradley Walker Tomlin, excuse me, and there's the irascible photograph again. William Baziotes was very influenced by the surrealists and dream states and dream images, and I guess one of the things that happens with these artists is although they're all kind of dealing with like Jungian imagery and primordial things and this myth making that the others were, their stages never result in big breakthroughs like you had with Pollock, like you had with Rothko, like you had with Newman. They don't ever develop a strong, identifiable style associated with them, even though people like de Kooning doesn't. These guys were just unfortunate that their work never caught on. Some of them just kept images in their work for too long, perhaps. That's what some people say. Anyway, Basio himself is a fantastic painter. I love looking at his works in museums especially. And one thing that I guess the lack of success did contribute to these guys is that when you see their work, it does seem very fresh today because you haven't seen it a gazillion times, and also because they didn't repeat themselves a gazillion times. Theodore Stamos, he's there with the Erasmus in that photograph. But his career is not distinguished. Bradley Walker Tomlin, one of my absolute favorites. He develops this kind of all-over composition really early on with just this real distinctive mark making and a almost like a language that he's invented. Again, some of his just surfaces are so energized and enlivened by these marks that just, again, create the same types of layers that Jackson Pollock's create, but they're they're more controlled marks. They are these marks that are like blocks that are like geometric shapes, and so they don't have quite the same liveliness that Pollock's do. One more big Bradley Walker Tomlin to look at. Ah, so good. He's one of my favorite painters, actually. Richard Pousset Dart was very much interested in the discussions about primitivism and about uh, archaic symbolism in the 1940s that other members of the abstract expressionist group were having. And a lot of his works really explore these themes of totems and symbols from the past. He participated with the Irascible photograph. He was somebody who went to the meetings of the art club, but ultimately he kind of lost his fervor for the group aspect of abstract expressionism and kind of distanced himself from the rest of the group. He felt more that he was more spiritually inclined than they were, and so he's partially responsible for, I think, not having the same amount of success as they did because of his separation from them. But his work certainly belonged to this group, and he was a contributor of the movement in its first 10 years. One last work by him, again a very large image, abstract, but there's still symbols that kind of come through. Even later work than this, you have a feeling like he's going off into the cosmos. His works seems like they're star charts and they're celestial. You should Google him. He's cool. And here's one last image just to illustrate what I was just talking about in the last slide. These kind of celestial orbs. They almost seem like mosaics. Also, Islamic tile work is what it reminds me of too. So Richard Pousset Dart, really fascinating artist, as are all of these ones that are lesser known, unfortunately, for them. But we still get to look at their work. So that's it for the Abstract Expressionists. Thanks for sticking around for this talk, and I hope you have a good week.